Hello again, ClawedWarship42 here, with another horror story, fanfic written by me. Today's episode is called The Graveyard Shift. I think you'll like this one. It was a bright and sunny day on the island of Sodor. The hustle and bustle of Thomas and his friends went like clockwork. Everyone was in high spirits, except for James. James was stuck shunting at the coal mine. Trucks constantly joked and teased him as he chugged to and fro from siding to siding. The coal dust was ruining his splendid red paint, covering his red coat with a black, murky dust over his boiler. "Pah," said James. "This coal is ruining my splendid red coat. How am I ever going to look like a useful, charming, a splendid engine ever again?" The trucks just shrugged and guffawed at his expense. "That sounds like a bit of a personal problem there, rusty red scrap iron," said one truck. "What's so important about being the same color as a baboon's butt?" said another truck. "James, you're painted red because you are so slow," said a third truck. The trucks all laughed and howled again. James was fed up with their nonsense and gave them a large bump out of frustration, sending them off the rails with coal spilling out all over. James just replied, "Oops," as he looked at the accident he just created. "Now you've done it," said his driver. "The Fat Controller won't be pleased about this." And he wasn't. "James, I am disappointed with you this afternoon. Your accident has caused confusion and delay. Therefore, you will stay overnight here and help with repair efforts. I've got Henry to help this evening. He won't be pleased to be helping you. He's missed out on running the kipper tonight." "Yes, sir. Sorry, sir," James muttered, just looking down at his buffers. Later that night, Henry arrived with the breakdown train. The two engines worked in unison, cleaning up the mess. "Why can't you just control yourself?" said Henry. "Because of you, the flying kipper was given to Donald and Douglas, and I missed out on my night's run." James said nothing. He felt guiltier than ever. Henry took notice. "All right. I'm sorry. I guess I'm just a bit tired and I missed my seaside freight run. But hey, let's get these trucks shunted quickly and we get some sleep afterwards." "All right then," said James. He smiled a little bit. The two engines shunted and sorted the aisles of trucks here and there. Henry was finishing his last line of trucks when he spotted something strange at the end of the tracks. There were no buffers at the end of the siding, only more rails that followed into a pitch-black boarded-up mine shaft entrance. "Strange," said Henry. "I don't recall any closed shafts on this line." His driver replied, "Neither do I, old boy. Let's have a look at it." Henry pulled the line of trucks out of the siding and into another. He chucked towards the mine shaft nose first, and his driver stopped him outside the entrance. His driver got out and peered between the boards on the entrance. He could still barely see inside. The fireman turned on Henry's lamps, and the driver nearly fell over screaming from what he saw inside. "Ah!" he said as he fell backwards about 10 feet. Henry nervously replied, What is it?" The fireman came running up to him. The fireman says, "What's wrong with you? Are you hurt? Why are you screaming?" The driver shakily pointed a finger at the entrance, whimpering in fear. A nearby worker came running over to see the commotion, as did James and his crew. "Henry, what's the matter?" said James. "I don't know, James. Something in this old mine shaft spooked my driver." The worker and James's crew grabbed some nearby axes and pry bars, and working in unison, they ripped off the boards blocking the entrance of the shaft. As Henry's lamp lit up what was inside, everyone was in shock and disgust from what they were seeing. Within the entrance was an old, scrap, rusty tank engine. It was clear it hadn't been moved in decades. Although scrap engines were common to Henry and James, something was very different about this one, as it was scarred, and its decayed face was still visible on a smoke box door. The engine's eyes were vacant black sockets, a skull-like nose, and a severely drooped lower jaw with teeth, so few but visible and jagged-like. sick mind would abandon an engine like this, said James's driver. I don't like it here. Let's go back to the shed, said Henry. I agree, replied James. The two engines finished cleaning up the accident and made their way to the sheds. James and Henry stayed overnight at the coal mine. Now the two backed into a shed ready to go to sleep. Their crews had left for home, but James and Henry were far from getting any sleep. They couldn't stop talking about the disgusting sight they just saw. How could anyone be so cruel, said James. I've seen a lot of disturbing things on this island. This is unreal. This is just sickening and cruel, said Henry. Oh, the thought of it makes me ill, thought James. Me too. But let's not let it ruin our evening. Let's try to get some sleep, Henry said as he darted to doze off. James found it difficult to shut his eyes, but eventually he did so after pure exhaustion. It was around midnight. James's eyes suddenly burst open and he was awake again. He didn't know why he woke up, as it was still dark out and the moon shone over the coal yards. Presently he heard a noise, a groaning and squeaking sound, like rusty wheels being rolled after a very long time of no use. James was frightened. His eyes darted back and forth. Henry, wake up! Do you hear that? Henry awoke with a snort. What is it? Do you hear that? Said James. Henry listened closely and he heard the noise too. What is that noise? Said Henry. That's what I'm looking around for, said James. The sound changed along with the squeaks of metal wheels being rolled on the tracks. And a ghostly-like moaning was heard. It sounded like an animal bit in extreme pain. The noise got louder and louder until James spotted a shape moving from the spot where the mine shaft was. Henry, look at the mine shaft. Two engines saw the silhouette of a tank engine rolling towards the middle of the yard. The moaning turned into a wailing. A ghostly wailing of pain started to echo around the mine. James and Henry were frozen in fear. The wailing turned into a screaming like someone was on fire or in excruciating pain. As the engine's face came into view from the moonlight, James and Henry saw the engine's mouth disfigured and open, being the source of the screaming. The screaming continued for 30 seconds before it suddenly stopped. James and Henry were now shaking in their buffers, shut their eyes, then both opened their eyes again. The engine was gone from where they had saw it. Both of them briefly sighed out of relief from what they had seen. Then their eyes focused ahead of them, and the engine was back now, only 50 feet away from them. It was making a wheezing sound that sounded like sick breathing. It suddenly charged at them, its face shaking violently as James and Henry screamed out of fear for their lives, and suddenly the noise stopped. All James and Henry could hear was white noise. Constant ringing. He opened his eyes, and so did Henry. The two were unharmed, and dawn started to break over the yard. The engine's drivers had arrived and steamed them back to Tidmouth. Edward greeted them as they backed into their berths. Hello, old chaps. Looks a rough night at the coal mine for you two. Well, Edward suddenly stopped, and he noticed Henry backed down into the berth and disappeared into the back without saying a word. James then backed in with a sullen look on his face. James, what is it? James looked at Edward, still frowning. James, what happened? Said Edward. I don't know the politest way of describing what kind of night we had, said James. Come on, then. Talk to me. I'll do anything I can help. Just talk to me. James only muttered, We saw a scrap engine last night. I have never seen one before like this. As James laid down the details, Edward's face changed from concerned to sad and depressed light. Oh, my dear James. I'm so sorry. I should have told you if you found him. James eyed Edward's question like. His name was Malvern. He wasn't a bad engine, but he wasn't a perfect engine either. What are you saying, Edward? Hell with it, said James. He worked primarily at the coal mine. He was very cocky and arrogant, also careless, which is a dangerous cocktail to have. He got put on shunting duty and the trucks were causing mischief. He bumped them out of frustration, sending them flying into the mine shaft, causing a cave-in which killed 10 workers inside and injured 5 others out. Malvern felt he did nothing wrong. Blamed it on everything else but himself. Could never take responsibility for his own actions. Foreman made an example out of him for his lack of empathy and trapped him in an old shaft. Boarded him up, and that's where he sat until he eventually died from disrepair and neglect. Before his passing, workers would hear him moaning and groaning as the rust consumed his wheels, his boiler, and finally his body. He would plead for someone to help, but no one ever did. And eventually, he was completely forgotten about. James could only stare at Edward with wide eyes and in shock. I should have told you before, old chap, but I figured, no one would just find his body randomly. Now he haunts the line not as a malevolent spirit, but a frightening one, like a warning to others. James had no words to follow up after that. The 2 engines just sat there in their berths as the sun began to set again. The end.